Finally, fact number 4, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite their having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number 1, their leader was dead. And Jewish messianic expectations had no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be shamefully executed by them as a criminal. 2, Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the general resurrection of the dead at the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples suddenly came to believe so strongly that God had raised Jesus from the dead that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. But then the obvious question arises. What in the world caused them to believe such an un-Jewish and outlandish thing? Luke Johnson, a New Testament scholar at Emory University, muses, some sort of powerful, transformative experience is required to generate the sort of movement earliest Christianity was. And N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, that is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. In summary, there are 4 facts agreed upon by the majority of scholars: Jesus' burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Now, in his early published work, Dr. Ehrman expressed skepticism about these facts. He insisted that we cannot really affirm these facts. Why not? Well, he gave 2 reasons. First, he said, historians cannot say that a miracle probably occurred. But here he was obviously confusing the evidence for the resurrection with the best explanation of the evidence. The resurrection of Jesus is a miraculous explanation of the evidence. But the evidence itself is not miraculous. None of these 4 facts is in any way supernatural or inaccessible to the historian. To give an analogy, did you know that after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, there was actually a plot to steal his body as it was being transported by train back to Illinois? Now, the historian will obviously want to know whether this plot was foiled or not. Was Lincoln's body missing from the train? Was it successfully interred in the tomb in Springfield? Did his closest associates, like Secretary of War Stanton or Vice President Johnson, claim to have seen appearances of Lincoln alive after his death, and so on? These are questions any historian can investigate, and it's the same with the 4 facts about Jesus. But Professor Ehrman had a second reason why he thought the historian cannot affirm these facts. The gospel accounts of these events are hopelessly contradictory. But the problem with this line of argument is that it assumes 3 things. 1, that the inconsistencies are irresolvable rather than merely apparent. 2, that the inconsistencies lie at the heart of the narrative rather than just in the secondary peripheral details. And 3, that all of the accounts have an equal claim to historical reliability, since the presence of inconsistencies in a later, less reliable source does nothing to undermine the credibility of an earlier, more credible source. In fact, when you look at the supposed inconsistencies, what you find is that most of them, like the names and number of the women who visited the tomb, are merely apparent, not real. Moreover, the alleged consistencies are found in the secondary circumstantial details of the story and have no effect at all on the 4 facts as I've stated them. So most historians haven't been deterred by these sorts of objections. And in fact, Dr. Ehrman has himself come to rethink his position on these issues. Inconsistencies in the details notwithstanding, he now recognizes that we have solid traditions, not only for Jesus' burial, but also for the women's discovery of the empty tomb. And therefore, he says, we can conclude with some certainty that Jesus was in fact buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb, and that 3 days later the tomb was found empty. When I discovered that Professor Ehrman had reversed himself on this question, my admiration for his honesty and scholarly objectivity shot up. Very few scholars, once they've gone into print on an issue, have the courage to rethink that issue and admit that they were wrong. Dr. Ehrman's reversal of his opinion on these matters is testimony not merely to the force of the evidence for these 4 facts, but also to his determination to follow the evidence wherever it leads. What this means is that my first contention is not an issue of disagreement in tonight's debate. The whole debate will therefore turn upon Dr. Ehrman's response to my second contention, namely that the best explanation of these facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. This, of course, was the explanation that the eyewitnesses themselves gave, and I can think of no better explanation. The resurrection hypothesis passes all of the standard criteria for being the best explanation, such as explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, and so forth. Of course, down through history, various alternative naturalistic explanations of the resurrection have been proposed, such as the conspiracy hypothesis, the apparent death hypothesis, the hallucination hypothesis, and so on. In the judgment of contemporary scholarship, however, none of these naturalistic hypotheses has managed to provide a plausible explanation of the facts, nor does Dr. Ehrman support any of these naturalistic explanations of the facts. So why, we may ask, does Dr. Ehrman not accept the resurrection as the best explanation? The answer is simple. The resurrection is a miracle. And Dr. Ehrman denies the possibility of establishing a miracle. He writes, because historians can only establish what probably happened, and a miracle of this nature is highly improbable, the historian cannot say it probably occurred. This argument against the identification of miracles is an old one, already refuted in the 18th century by such eminent scholars as William Paley and George Campbell, and is rejected as fallacious by most contemporary philosophers as well. Now, I promise to say more about this later, but for now, let me simply say that in the absence of some naturalistic explanation of the facts, Dr. Ehrman's hesitancy about embracing the resurrection of Jesus as the best explanation is really quite unnecessary. Dr. Ehrman would be quite within his rational rights to embrace a miraculous explanation like the resurrection. And so would we. In conclusion, then, I think that there is good historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Specifically, I've staked out 2 basic contentions for discussion tonight. 1, there are 4 historical facts which must be explained by any adequate historical hypothesis: Jesus' burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the very origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And number 2, the best explanation of these facts is that Jesus rose from the dead.